Well, I don't mind cooking at home. It is safer and probably not as expensive as having a meal at a restaurant, but, I'm not an expert in preparing food, and, which is more importantly, those fusion restaurants feature such a diversity of national cuisines that sometimes I can't help but eat out well just for some variety.
What is the distinction between such similar meaning words as various and different? The language doesn't tolerate duplicates, and of course there are no absolute synonyms. Different means not the same as another or each other, unlike in nature, form or quality, and its closest synonym is distinct, whereas its antonyms are alike, identical and same. Various means more than one or several, and its synonymous set looks like sundry, motley, manifold and miscellaneous. If we intend to emphasize multiplicity, we'll prefer various. But if it is more important for us to contrast something, then different sounds more suitable. But why then, in the sentence, after the pandemic, we might be able to safely go to different countries again? Why in this sentence? Why are we not at all confused by the word different? We are talking about variety, not differences between countries, aren't we? If we take a closer look at the etymology of these words, we may discover the source of how the two vectors diverged, only to meet again at the same point. Variety comes from French variété and directly from the Latin word veritatem, meaning absence of monotony. The linguist Hugh Kent wrote in 1926.
Variety's grammar is barbarous. Its style is original and unique and completely independent of any other writing. Its phraseology is wild and revolutionary, and its diction is the result of miscegenation among shop talk, slang, Broadway colloquialisms, sporting neologisms and impatient short-cutting.
Both the origin and behavior of the word diversity are much more decorous. It appeared in Middle English through Old French from Latin diversus, which means turn aside. Variety may imply that the things which differ, whether they are fundamentally similar or completely dissimilar, are related because they contribute to the same end and play part in the formation of the same whole. Diversity is the quality of being diverse or different. It is difference or unlikeness. Diversity, though often used interchangeably with variety, distinctly stresses the marked difference or divergence of the individuals, parts or elements, and seldom suggests even a class or categorical likeness. Diversity tends to refer to the difference in people, ethnic background, gender, etc. Variety is more to do with choice. For example, in shops and restaurants, and its closest synonym, a much more specific word in this case, is assortment, a miscellaneous collection of things or people. So, variety mainly brings the idea of a choice, whereas diversity has mainly something to do with the idea of a difference.
This survey found that a lack of variety and poor nutritional quality of foods limits shoppers' ability to eat healthfully.
Yes. And people said they wanted greater variety and better quality at a reasonable price.
The craving for variety rather than for quality is one of the chief causes of England's being Europe's gastronomic sump.
I don't understand politicians or public personalities who talk about promoting non-traditional sexual relations. After all, we are not talking about variety to choose from.
I mean, to choose one or the other, but about the natural diversity among people which has not yet been properly studied.
Yes, and it may be anthropologists, sexologists or psychologists who can help people understand themselves, but certainly neither politicians or clergymen.
And now let's see how these two concepts, variety and diversity, work in the field of language education. Historically, in the minds of many people, there is a rigid opposition between grammar translation and communicative teaching methods. This opposition is artificial, far-fetched, and feeds only on the long-gun ideas that there are two languages, written and oral. This, of course, is possible, but only in one single case, if a person has never learned to read and write. The division into written and oral forms of language existence is also conditioned, as well as the allocation of various language aspects. Traditionally, those are speaking and writing, and listening and reading. All these processes do not exist without each other, and it is impossible to study them in isolation. Grammar, the construction of utterances, vocabulary, word formation, phonetics, and stylistics are also conditionally divided basic platforms under the four functional superstructures of the key skills that I have listed: speaking and listening, writing and reading. Such a dissection of the language gives us an illusion that we can embrace the immensity and proudly say a rather stupid thing, as learned the language, or she knows English perfectly, as if it were a multiplication table or the Pythagorean theorem.
Right. And this reduces demotivation. On the other hand, some have another delusion.
I know a lot of words, but...
And a lot is how many?
I know grammar, but...
What for?
I can understand speech well by ear, but...
Have you tried to speak yourself?
There are quite a few approaches and techniques of language teaching. For example, in the direct method, all teaching occurs in the target language, encouraging the learner to think in that language. The learner does not practice translation or use their native language in the classroom. Practitioners of this method believe that learners should experience a second language without any interference from their native tongue. The audiolingual approach encourages students to develop habits that support language learning. Students learn primarily through pattern drills, particularly dialects, which the teacher uses to help students practice and memorize the language. These dialects follow standard configurations of communication. Proponents of the structural approach understand language as a set of grammatical rules that should be learned one at a time in a specific order. It focuses on mastering these structures, building one skill on top of another instead of memorizing vocabulary. This is similar to how young children learn a new language naturally. The total physical response method highlights oral comprehension by allowing the learner to respond to basic commands like open the door or sit down. It combines language and physical movements for a comprehensive learning experience. With task-based language teaching, students complete real-world tasks using their target language. This technique encourages fluency by boosting the learner's confidence with each task accomplished and reducing direct mistake correction. The Suggestopedia language learning method was developed in the 1970s by psychotherapist Georgi Lazanov. It is sometimes also known as the positive suggestion method, but it later became sometimes known as desuggestopedia. Apart from using physical surroundings and a good classroom atmosphere to make students feel comfortable, here are some of the main tenets of these second language teaching methods. Deciphering, where the teacher introduces new grammar and vocabulary. concert sessions where the teacher reads a text and the students follow along with music in the background. This can be both active and passive. Elaboration, where students finish what they've learned with dramas, songs and games. Introduction, in which the teacher introduces new things in a playful manner. Production, where students speak and interact without correction or interruption. The silent way is an interesting teaching method that isn't that common, but it does have some solid footing. After all, the goal in most language classes is to make them as student-centered as possible. In the silent way, the teacher talks as little as possible, with the idea that students learn best when discovering things on their own. Learners are encouraged to be independent and to discover and figure out language on their own. Instead of talking, the teacher uses gestures and facial expressions to communicate, as well as props, including the famous cuisinaire rods. These are rods of different colors and lengths.
He wears shoes every day. She wears shoes every day. Yesterday. She wore shoes yesterday. They wore shoes yesterday. Did they wear shoes yesterday?
Functional notional approach first of all recognizes that language is purposeful communication. The reason people talk is that they want to communicate something to someone else. Parts of speech like nouns and verbs exist to express language functions and notions. People speak to inform, disagree, question, persuade, evaluate, and perform various other functions. Language is also used to talk about concepts or notions like time, events, places, etc. Each of these approaches is interesting in its own way, but none of them is universal. You can borrow something effective from each one. None of the approaches can take into account all the individual characteristics of perception and assimilation of information. Every student has their own learning strategies. The multiplicity of approaches is the variety, the choice that the teacher faces when starting work with a student or a group. It is to the student's audience that the word diversity can be applied. The smaller the group, the more accurate the choice. Ideally, the teacher can take into account the student's request only with individual or pair training, provided that the mentor has, as one of my teachers said, an arsenal of approaches and techniques that is variety. I must point out that nowadays many of these approaches in their original form simply do not work. Every year there is a strongly growing tendency to individualize the learning process. Even now, group training, especially among teenagers and adults, is more like old ladies sitting on a bench. They always have a topic to chatter about and plenty of time. They have no clear goal and they're short on mind. Although, in the end, not only does individualized education turn out to be more effective, more dynamic and of high quality standards, but it is also financially more reasonable for clients. Not for conveyor-type language institutions, though, which are extremely persuasive to promote group happiness, hiding behind pseudo-mythological reasons and perverting the essence of the communicative approach.
А вот если бы я бы не вышла, ты бы вышла? Да, конечно бы вышла. Чем мне дома-то сидеть? Нет, я вижу, что вышла. Я спрашиваю, если бы я не вышла, ты бы вышла? Я тебе говорю, вышла бы. Ты же вышла, и я вышла. Да я вижу, что ты вышла. Заладила, вышла, не вышла. Лишь бы языком молоть своим старческим.
In everyday, I'd even say Philistine understanding, eclecticism is a mixture, a combination of heterogeneous styles, ideas, views, often used as a synonym for the word tasteless. The term eclecticism was introduced by Patamon of Alexandria, who called his school eclectic. And now the word eclecticism has almost lost its former negative aura. At the New Forward Language School, we use diverse teaching methods, sometimes not even paying much attention to the theoretical justification. We're talking about harmonious synthesis or principled eclecticism. Our tasks are determined by taking into account the individual characteristics, problems, and personality of individual students, as well as their optimal suitability for being the right object of applying various techniques to. The corresponding combination of different methods from the standpoint of principled eclecticism is a new method of teaching for each student every time. Philistine interpretation confuses eclecticism with syncretism, when heterogeneous things are combined without their harmonious unification. Eclecticism tries by means of criticism to see useful, consistent principles from various approaches and originally link them into one whole, while syncretism randomly combines heterogeneous elements. This is how cringe is born, by the way. Thus, eclecticism is a conceptual approach that does not adhere strictly to one paradigm or set of assumptions, but instead relies on several theories, styles, or ideas to gain additional understanding of the subject, or to apply different theories to specific cases. The criterion for determining the truth of the principles that they try to combine is usually common sense. This concept is quite slippery and not a bit scientific, so principled eclecticism, its justification as such, depends only on the learning goals. The clearer the task that the students initially set for themselves, the easier it is to choose the ingredients for a major portion. And it is important to remember that the ingredients, that is, methods and techniques, generally do not change. There are no author's methods, but goals can and even should transform over time, which means that the fire in the creative laboratory of the alchemist teacher should never go out. This was well expressed by Leibniz, who argued that all systems of philosophy are right in what they assert, being wrong only about what they deny. Expressing the desire to reckon with all possible trends and find the grain of truth in them through criticism, principled eclecticism, therefore, can denote the requirement of a breadth of outlook in the justification of one's own system. Different strokes for different folks.
Gonna keep on walking.